Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the 14th module of the History of Christianity 1 course. In the previous modules, we've talked about various aspects of the medieval church. In this section, we'll examine one specific set of events that happened in the medieval period. But it was not limited to Western Europe. Rather, it was Western Europe reacting to things that had been happening in the East for centuries and could no longer be ignored. Today, we're going to talk about the Crusades. This historic topic is actually fairly relevant for recent history. It still comes up regularly. In the relatively recent discussions about ISIS, the Taliban, and refugees flooding to the West, many in the surrounding debate are bringing up the Crusades. Some bring it up as an example that we should follow. Some bring it up as an explanation of why Islam hates and/or distrusts the West. And some use it as a rhetorical weapon against Christians to try to gain the high moral ground, that is, crusader shaming. In all these social and political debates about all these things, I rarely hear anyone who actually takes the history seriously and uses it accurately and helpfully. We will attempt to examine history fairly and accurately and judge everything by the biblical standard. And as usual, we'll start with just surveying the timeline to put these events in the general scope of what we've already covered in this course. There were crusades, plural, which covered a little less than 2 centuries in the medieval period. In 1095 AD, Urban II preached in favor of military action to help the Eastern Empire fight back against Islamic aggression. The First Crusade took place from 1096 to 1099, and in 1099 it finally captured Jerusalem. The Second Crusade was from 1147 to 1149. The Third Crusade was 1187 through 1192. The Fourth was 1202 to 1204. The Fifth took place from 1217 to 1221 AD. The Sixth Crusade was 1228 through 1229. The Seventh was 1248 through 1252. And the Eighth and final Crusade took place from 1270 to 1271 AD. Obviously, you see, there were a series of events, not just one, which are all called Crusades, because they were all related over a period of around 2 centuries. And now let's examine them in more detail, starting with the reasons behind the Crusades. So, what were the causes of the Crusades? Well, we've already mentioned the primary cause in earlier sections. That is, the rise of Islam led to military conquest coming out of Arabia in many directions, and that included the invasion and occupation of around half of the eastern part of Christendom in the East, and all of northern Africa, which was primarily Christian before that time. This led to the destruction of classical Greek, Roman, and Byzantine civilizations in those lands. The invasions were violent conquests and usually resulted in oppressive occupation. There was some toleration of Christians and Jews, but they were always relegated to second-class status, which included humiliation, oppression, and higher tax burden. In some cases, there was ethnic and/or cultural cleansing, and even genocide if the people refused to submit. And in most cases, there was widespread slavery and oppression for those who did not convert. Conquered peoples were given the option of conversion or death or slavery. There are many testimonies of brutality by the Muslim conquerors, which describe them as being more animal or demonic than human in their treatment of the conquered peoples. And they were especially brutal against Christian churches and Christian leaders and monastics. However, many people remained Christian, and some of the conquered lands were only converted to Islam over centuries of oppression. And one aspect of this that was particularly painful for Christians was the capture of the Holy Land. Those places were obviously special to Christians, and many Christians wanted to travel to see the places where Jesus lived and worked. At some times, Christian pilgrims were allowed to safely travel to the holy sites. At other times, they were attacked, harassed, and oppressed by the Muslim occupiers. And so, pilgrims often had to resort to bearing arms or hiring protection in order to travel to the Holy Land. And in 1009, the shrine of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem was destroyed by the Muslim ruler there. even though it was later rebuilt. And this all brought tension and resentment among Christians about unbelievers ruling over the places that were special to them. So, the Crusades were a series of defensive wars to counter a long-term and ongoing invasion and subjugation of Christian lands and peoples. For perspective, I've assigned a short video that compares the battles of the Crusades with the battles of conquest that were initiated by Muslim invasions. And there is no comparison. Any narrative that paints the Crusaders as oppressive imperialistic aggressors who attack a peaceful people is either profoundly historically ignorant or deeply deceptive. The biggest scandal about why the Crusades happened is why they did not happen a lot sooner. By the time of the Crusades, Christendom had been losing a defensive war against Islamic aggression for 450 years. Now, as an aside, it is necessary to address the politically incorrect question, is Islam a religion of peace, as is sometimes claimed? Now, to be fair, we have to admit that the question is complicated, because some Muslims are nice and peaceful people, and some are not. And the same could be said about Christians. So, in order to answer that question, I suggest looking at two categories of evidence: the foundational teaching and the historical record. That means, first, we should conceptually separate people and their actions from their ideology. For example, there are professing Christians who want to bomb abortion clinics or to convert infidels with the threat of violence, and we can ask if they're being faithful to the teaching of Christ when they do that. And the answer is no. They are betraying the teaching of Christ and give some reason to doubt if they are genuine Christians. Christians who pray for their enemies and want to convert non-believers by sharing the gospel and demonstrating it with self-sacrificing service, even to the point of dying for their enemies, those are being consistent with the teaching and example of Christ, but not the clinic bombers. And then in a similar way, Muslims who genuinely want to peacefully live with Christians under the possibility of a free democracy, they are actually being inconsistent with the teaching and example of Muhammad. And Muslims who want to conquer all free democracies and impose Sharia law by any means, including violence and deception, they are being consistent with the teaching and example of Muhammad. Muhammad himself was a warlord, spreading Islam through conquest. Historian Rodney Stark wrote, in what came to be known as his farewell address, Muhammad is said to have told his followers, I was ordered to fight all men until they say, there is no God but Allah. This is entirely consistent with the Quran 9:5, which says, slay the idolaters wherever you find them, and take them captive, and besiege them, and prepare for them each ambush. In this spirit, Muhammad's heirs set out to conquer the world. And many more passages from the Quran could be given to demonstrate this claim. So, warfare and conquest are a consistent part of the ideology and foundational teaching of Islam, not an aberration. And we need to winsomely, but honestly, ask the question whether what is typically called radical Islam is really normal, faithful Islam, acting consistently with what the Quran says about these things. Groups like the Taliban and ISIS themselves argue that they are the ones being faithful to Islamic teaching, and they criticize less radical Muslims for not joining them in fighting as Muhammad commanded. And historically, Islam has always been an aggressor. It has invaded and conquered every land it was able to, and unsuccessfully attempted to conquer many others. And it has not dealt in good faith with its opponents. It has dealt extremely harshly with conquered peoples. There is just a huge amount of historical data that clearly demonstrates this to be true. Islam has caused centuries of bloodshed and virtually no peace. So this evidence forces me to conclude about the question of Islam. Muslim people are not necessarily the enemy, Pray for them, love them, tell them about the real Jesus. That is their only hope, just like it's our only hope. But Islam and the teaching of Muhammad has clearly demonstrated itself as an aggressive enemy. Many Muslims are deceived, but many are consciously, intentionally warring against everything that is not Islamic as a key part of their Muslim faith. Therefore, in order to be honest and realistic, we should realize that Islam is a cancer that will destroy the world if not treated. And like literal cancer, ignoring it will not make it go away, but will only let it grow. Because aggressive expansion, usually through conquest, is at the heart of Islam. And if military conquest is not possible, deceit and subversion are the standard Islamic strategies. Now, how we as Christians should respond to this, that's the big question. And let's see what helpful insights we can get from history before we come back to this question. And that brings us to the history of the Crusades. Like I mentioned, Crusades is plural. This was not one war or conflict, but an ongoing series of conflicts. And the Crusades were a small part of a larger ongoing world conflict that had been going on for centuries before the Crusades and still continues in some form until today. And of course, logically, we'll start with the First Crusade. The Byzantine emperor sent a message to the West asking for help after losing much of Asia Minor to the Islamic Turks, and because Constantinople itself was threatened. Again, quoting Rodney Stark. In his letter, the emperor detailed gruesome tortures of Christian pilgrims to the Holy Land and vile desecrations of churches, altars, and baptismal fonts. Should Constantinople fall to the Turks, not only would thousands more Christians be murdered, tortured, and raped, but also the most holy relics of the Savior gathered over the centuries would be lost, the emperor wrote. Therefore, in the name of God, we implore you to bring this city all the faithful soldiers of Christ. In your coming, you will find your reward in heaven, and if you do not come, God will condemn you. So, the overall purpose of the First Crusade was to help protect Constantinople from the invading Turks. It was to rescue Christian brothers and sisters who were being conquered and subjugated. And the ultimate purpose was to recapture the Holy Land for Christianity and to protect Christian pilgrims from violence while traveling to the Holy Land. And there was a rallying moment and motivation given for the Crusades. Pope Urban II spoke publicly in response to the emperor's request. He said, Europeans should stop fighting one another for power and personal glory. Rather, they should fight for God against the real enemies of God. And Urban promised merit for fighting in the East, and he promised the forgiveness of sins. He said that people earned indulgences by going to the Holy Land on crusade. And so, at that time, going on crusade became an alternative to monasticism for those who sought to earn forgiveness and assure themselves of eternal life. And the response from the crowd to Urban's speech was shouts of Deus vult, which is Latin for God wills it. So Europe was stirred up to send armies to the east to fight by the religious leader of Europe. And they were stirred to fight at least partly for religious reasons and motivations. Now, the First Crusade happened in two prongs, or two waves. The first was a mob militia. They were very loosely organized and badly behaved, and they attacked and plundered Christian nations as they traveled through them on their way to the east. This group was defeated by the Turks near Nicaea. But the second prong was made up of Christian nobles. It was the organized armies of European kings and nobles, primarily German, French, and Italian in the First Crusade. These armies were self-financed at great personal risk and sacrifice. Some of the leaders knowingly bankrupted themselves in order to do this, without hope of recouping their cost, and some without hope of even returning to Europe. This second group traveled independently, but they all met at Constantinople. They swore loyalty in an uneasy alliance with the Eastern Emperor, but they functionally fought independently from the Byzantine leadership. This group was led by many European nobles, but Geoffrey of Bouillon eventually stood out as the leader, and they fought successfully. They first captured Nicaea, and then defeated the Muslim army that came to reinforce their enemies. Then they besieged and eventually captured Antioch against great odds, and by some accounts, the victory at Antioch came by miraculous intervention. And they finally besieged and eventually captured Jerusalem. When we look at the way the Crusader armies behaved in battle and how they treated the people in the cities that they defeated, we need to conclude that they behaved badly by modern standards. Accounts vary, but they killed some or possibly all of the inhabitants of the conquered cities, and they massacred the Jews who were living in Jerusalem when it was conquered. By modern standards of warfare, these things are unacceptable. However, we need to remember that they were not fighting by modern standards of warfare. So we also need to ask how they behaved according to their contemporary standards of warfare. Remember that asking the compared to what question is very helpful for understanding history. And according to contemporary standards, the crusading armies behaved fairly decently. One historian concluded, "The Crusaders, however, were no more brutal than Muslims, not more brutal than was expected in warfare at the time, and there were examples of chivalrous conduct on both sides. In that day, there was a commonly understood agreement that everyone who stayed in a besieged city were enemy combatants, risking death. Both sides would have done the same. Both sides slaughtered prisoners. Of course, there were some soldiers and armies who behaved extra horribly, but we can ask whether that was the exception or the rule. There are some contemporary writings from Crusaders who bragged about their virtue because they had killed all the women without raping or abusing them. And the Islamic soldiers did not express those kinds of sentiments when they were invading the West. Not because they didn't kill innocents, but because they raped the women before killing them. Thomas Madden wrote, "It is easy enough for modern people to dismiss the Crusades as morally repugnant and cynically evil. Such judgments, however, tell us more about the observer than the observed. They are based on uniquely modern and therefore Western values. If, from the safety of our modern world, we are quick to condemn the medieval Crusader, we should be mindful that he would be just as quick to condemn us. Our infinitely more destructive wars waged for the sake of political and social ideologies would, in his opinion, be lamentable wastes of human life. In both societies, the medieval and the modern, people fight for what is most dear to them. That is a fact of human nature." After the military victories, the Christian armies set up and fortified independent states in the newly reconquered lands. There were 4 kingdoms, centered in Edessa, in Antioch in Syria, in Tripoli, that is, the Tripoli in modern Lebanon, not the Tripoli in modern Libya, and in Jerusalem. Geoffrey of Bouillon became ruler of Jerusalem, but he refused to be called king. He said that Jesus is the king of Jerusalem. However, his successors after him called themselves kings of Jerusalem. And these kingdoms were later called the Crusader kingdoms. Now, as a point of clarification, the term Crusader comes from much later and was not used by the people we now call the Crusaders, and they did not use the term Crusades at that time. That term was only later used to describe these conflicts. The words crusade and crusaders comes from the word cross, because the Crusaders made a cross a part of their uniforms. They were marked with the cross and were motivated on behalf of the cross. Now, some of the Crusader kingdoms lasted for almost 2 centuries, and some of their buildings and fortifications can still be seen today in the Holy Land. The First Crusade ended with the successful capture of Jerusalem and the establishment of the Crusader kingdoms. After this, many of the armies and soldiers went home to Europe, but many stayed and defended the Crusader kingdoms against regular counter-invasions from Muslim armies. And that brings us to the Second Crusade. the Muslim armies fought back and eventually recaptured the city of Edessa, and that news shocked Europe and caused a second Crusader force to travel to the Holy Land. The famous monk Bernard of Clairvaux preached in favor of the Second Crusade. He promised that fighting in a crusade was a means of redemption. And this group was decisively defeated in a battle that is still used in textbooks as a classic military blunder. They also attempted to capture Damascus, but failed. So the Second Crusade was largely ineffective. Next is the story of the Third Crusade. Muslims from Egypt, under the leadership of Saladin, eventually recaptured Jerusalem, and this motivated German, French, and English armies to go as crusaders. This group was eventually led by the English king Richard the Lionhearted, who is the King Richard from the Robin Hood stories. This group recaptured the coast of the Holy Land and successfully defeated Saladin's armies, but they did not attack Jerusalem. They signed a peace treaty with Saladin. They reestablished the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which did not contain the actual city of Jerusalem, but the treaty assured peaceful access to Jerusalem for Christian pilgrims. The Fourth Crusade started normally with armies setting out toward the Holy Land via Egypt to fight Muslims, but for political power reasons, they actually diverted and attacked Constantinople. They fought and captured the Christian city from the Byzantines and set up a Western Latin rule in Constantinople. And of course, that was disastrous for the relationship between the East and West, and the Eastern Church and Western Church. The Fifth through Eighth Crusades were a series of fairly small-scale re-invasions and reinforcements of Crusader kingdoms, and these did not have any long-reaching effect. Jerusalem was once recaptured and then quickly lost. And finally, the Muslims recaptured Acre, which was the last Crusader stronghold. And by this time, Europe was too busy with other things, and so the Crusades ended. That is the brief history of the Crusades. Now, let's look at some of the results of the Crusades. First, the Crusades brought greater unity in the West. They had a common Latin language, and now they were united in a common cause. The nations which had regularly been fighting one another were now fighting together against a common enemy. And there was greater prestige for the papacy in calling the Crusades. The popes gained influence and power in being a unifying voice that influenced European politics. However, a negative result of the Crusades was a greater alienation between the Eastern and Western churches. We saw in earlier sections that the Eastern and Western churches had already split in the Great Schism before the Crusades, but the Crusades made the relationship even worse. There was a council that was connected with the Crusades that attempted to reconcile theological and liturgical differences between the Eastern and Western churches, but it was not successful. The Eastern Empire had asked the West for help, and the West tried to bully the East. The Pope said that the Eastern Church had to accept papal supremacy over all the Church before the West would send military aid. And they even attacked the East, like I mentioned. And there was, completely understandably, even greater enmity between Christians and Muslims as a result of the Crusades. Of course, the relations were never good, but Muslims treated Christians in their territories even harsher after the Crusades. However, I also need to note that the Crusades at least temporarily halted the advance of the Islamic invasions. Constantinople eventually did fall to Muslim invaders in the following centuries, but it probably would have fallen much earlier if not for Crusader armies coming to its defense. Muslims eventually continued to attempt to conquer Europe, finally turned back at Malta and Vienna. But these invasions may have been earlier and more successful if not for the Crusades. And the final result I want to mention are the knightly monastic orders, such as the Knights Templar and the Teutonic Knights. These orders combined monastic piety and practice with military discipline and activity. Their ideal was to be monastic warriors, both spiritually on behalf of piety and literally on behalf of justice. Some of these orders were corrupted, and they were all eventually suppressed and/or disbanded. And that brings us to evaluation of the Crusades, which we'll try to do honestly and accurately by biblical standards. We'll look at what was good and what was bad, and then we'll compare the Crusades to Augustine's just war theory and see how the Crusades measured up. First is the good of the Crusades. The Crusades were intending to do justice in standing for what was right and rescuing the oppressed. Remember that the Crusades were a response to the aggressive conquests of Islam. They were never an aggressive attempt to conquer Islam. And the Crusades left Europe at tremendous personal risk and sacrifice for a cause they believed to be honoring God. There were many examples of tremendous chivalry and bravery in war. And the Crusades were successful, at least for a while. The first crusade was a success, but the following crusades were less and less successful. It almost seems like God was with the first crusade, but not so much after that. But like I mentioned, the Crusades probably slowed down the Islamic advance into Europe. But there were some bad things about the Crusades as well. War is always hellish and can easily turn people into animals. It should not surprise us that men acted beastly in the midst of war. It is extremely difficult to love your enemy while he is killing your best friend. So we can understand the hatred and violence of war. We can understand it, but as Christians, we should never excuse it. Hatred and unjust violence is sin, and Christians should avoid it as much as possible and repent of it whenever it happens. Now, according to just war theory, wars can be fought in a way that is not sinful, and we'll look at that in a minute. And even when recognizing the barbarity of war, we can honestly ask, compared to what? Both compared with the barbarity that would have continued at the hands of the invading Muslims if the Crusades had not taken place, but also comparing the barbarity that took place on both sides. Just because one side acted like beasts does not necessarily mean that the other side is all saints. Both sides must be evaluated by biblical standards. And we can also evaluate them in their own context and not in utopia, by the choices available to them in their situation and not in some perfect world fantasy. If someone attempts to shame the Crusaders for their slaughter at the capture of Jerusalem, but never mentions the much greater slaughter when the Muslims reconquered Antioch, then they're not to be taken seriously. Overall, the Christian Crusaders acted much better than their Muslim counterparts. By any honest standard and historical assessment, the Muslims were magnitudes more brutal and took glee in the suffering and subjugation of their enemies. The Crusaders did not typically massacre, rape, or sell the conquered peoples into slavery, while that was the standard practice for the Muslim conquests. And second, the Crusades changed from what could be argued to be a just cause of defense and liberation at the start into a political power war. There were continuous infighting among the crusading armies. There were rivalries and struggles for power among the Europeans, and they even attacked their Byzantine allies. And they sometimes turned to oppressors of their conquered foes. Although it should be noted that the Crusader kingdoms did not persecute the Muslim citizens or hinder them from practicing their religion. And many of the Crusaders went on crusade and fought for mixed motives, some godly and some not. Some modern historians claim that the Crusades were for imperialism and plunder, but that's nonsense. The Crusades cost Europe tremendously. It did not benefit them financially at all. That's not what I'm talking about. Many Crusaders were motivated by serving God and His people. That's the good motive I'm talking about. But some were also motivated by personal glory, and that's not a good motive. And most were motivated by the promises of indulgence and forgiveness of sins. They were trying to somehow earn or at least contribute to their salvation by going on crusade. Now, that could be seen as a good intention and worthy goal for those who naively believe those promises, but it was bad because those promises were not true. It was theologically inaccurate and irresponsible to make those promises. So, to the extent that people went on crusade for that reason, they were deceived. And finally, the Crusades increased the enmity between Christians and Muslims. The enmity was already there, started and sustained by Islam, but the Crusades increased it and brought about a backlash against Christians who were living in Muslim lands, and even a purposeful extermination of Christians in the church in some of them. Now, by the way, the backlash to the Crusades was short-lived, and Islam did not use the Crusades as justification for their hatred of the West until the 1900s, when it became politically expedient to do so. But the Crusades certainly did not win Muslims to Christ, and may have made it harder to do so. And that brings us to evaluate the Crusades in terms of Augustine's just war theory. By way of review, according to this theory, a war is just if it is fought for a just cause, it is fought by proper authorities, and it is fought in a just manner with love. Now, I think the Crusades, at least the first Crusade, were fought for a just reason. We've seen that this was a defensive response to the Islamic aggression, and there was no peaceful options to protect the East from the ongoing war. And many of the Crusades were fought by proper authorities. There were unruly mobs that went on crusade, but most of the Crusades were by legitimate armies serving under legitimate rulers at their own expense. So by the first two criteria, the Crusades were a just war. However, by the third criterion, the Crusades were mixed. Some was fought by the just standards of that time, but there were also examples of misdeeds. The Crusades did not completely meet the standards of a just war, but at the same time, they were not completely unjust war either. History is complicated and messy. And now let's review. The Crusades were a defensive response to Islamic aggression and to a call for help from the Byzantine Empire. There were a series of crusades. They were successful at first, but less successful in the later crusades. They resulted in a temporary establishment and defense of crusader kingdoms in recaptured territory. And in the Crusades, we see the brutality of war and the corruption of power politics and bad theology. But we also see bravery and heroism in service of God. And that brings us to our discussion and application questions. First, how should Christians, when they have power, act toward an aggressive enemy who also has power? Now, for clarity, when I say power, I don't necessarily mean an official position, but I just mean the ability, resources, and opportunity to actually do something about it. Describe what you've learned from the Crusades that applies to this question. What good examples did you see from the Crusaders? What was good about what they did, and why did this stand out to you? How can you imitate their good example? And in what kind of situations would you put it into practice? And what bad examples did you see from the Crusaders? What was bad about what they did, and why do you think it was wrong? What steps can you take to protect yourself from making the same kinds of mistakes? And how can you apply all the insights you have gained from the Crusades? How can you apply the positive, and how can you avoid the negative examples in your own life and ministry? Second, how should Christians, when they have power, act towards vulnerable non-believers without power? What have you learned from the Crusades which applies to this question? What should Christians actively do, and what makes this a good thing to do? And how do the Crusades demonstrate that principle? And what should Christians avoid doing? Why should that be avoided? And how did the Crusades demonstrate that danger? What insights and principles have you learned from the Crusades that help you to address and apply this question? And in what ways can the modern church apply these insights as a local church? And in what ways can modern Christians apply these insights as citizens? Next, how can Christians, when they have power, stand for and defend justice while also protecting themselves from being unjustly corrupted by this kind of power? Describe what you've learned from the Crusades that applies to this question. What good was done by the Crusaders and why was it good? What bad was done by the Crusaders and why was it bad? What insights and principles have you learned from the Crusades? What opportunities do we as individual Christians have to stand for true biblical justice? And how should we respond and act out our Christianity in response to these opportunities? What opportunities do we have as the church community to stand for justice? How should we respond to these opportunities? What opportunities do we have as citizens in a pluralistic society to stand for justice in the name of Christ? How should we act in order to accomplish goals of Christ in that context? What dangers do we as individual Christians have to be corrupted? How can we protect ourselves from this danger? What dangers do we have as the church community to be corrupted or sidetracked while we address issues of justice? How can we avoid those pitfalls? And what dangers do we face as citizens and as the wider society of being corrupted by power? How can we resist and protect ourselves against that corruption? And how do you intend to live out all of these insights in the various roles that you have personally? And finally is the general question, what else did you learn and how can you put this into practice? Right now is the time to pause for discussion. Take as much time as you need to think through and discuss all these issues because they are important issues and questions. And when you're ready, come back for some guiding principles. So pause the video now. Now, let's look at some guiding principles. The first principle I would like to suggest is that Christians, as much as it is in our power to do so, we should always seek to uphold justice and protect the innocent. And that means that often we will need to defeat the guilty. Adam Smith once said that mercy to the guilty is cruelty to the innocent. Of course, as Christians, we cannot do this in the same way that non-Christians might do. Jesus commanded us to love our enemies and turn the other cheek, and we need to do all that we can to put that into practice. However, we misunderstand what Jesus was saying if we use those commands to allow or supplement injustice. Let me try to explain it this way. We need to turn the other cheek when someone strikes us, but we can never turn our neighbor's cheek. If someone strikes a child near me, my job is not to hold the child still so that the bad guy can hit him on the other side. My job is to protect the child. It would be injustice if I did not do something to protect the innocent from harm if I could. Now, that does not necessarily mean that I beat up the bad guy, but at least I try to restrain him or stand in front of the child so that the kid does not get hit again. The command to turn the other cheek does not prevent us from calling the police or stepping in to resist evil. And these things do not prevent Christians from serving in law enforcement or in the military. Christians just need to do those things in a totally upright way that upholds justice, and not in a way that is about personal vengeance. I suggest that Jesus' teaching on turning the other cheek, etc., is about not taking personal revenge with the motivation of pride and personal standing. And that does not nullify all the other biblical teaching about upholding justice and resisting evil. And all the biblical teaching on giving mercy is also true, and we should aim for that as well. But all the teachings about mercy assume a context of justice. Giving mercy without an overarching context of justice is not merciful, and it breeds injustice and anarchy. But within the context of genuine justice, which has the real possibility of punishment, mercy does demonstrate God's character. And that means in a national and international scope, as much as in our power, we should stand for justice and protect the innocent. I agree with Augustine that there is a possibility of war that can be just, but it should be a last resort, not a first choice. And it should always be done in a just way to demonstrate the justice of God as much as possible. It was right for the Crusaders to want to defend those attacked by the Islamic invasions. And as much as we have the power and authority, we should aim for just resistance of evil in all its forms. I think the modern church needs more strong and brave men acting like men. I think we need to be shaken out of our passivity and apathy and start to act like heroic warriors, leading our families, churches, companies, and communities with valor and righteous purpose, following the example of Christ, who was strong and effective while also being merciful and compassionate. However, there are some strong cautions. Jesus told us to beware the abuse of the sword. If we live by the sword, we will die by it. We should beware the corruption of power and use it only when just and necessary. We're just as sinful and liable to becoming the oppressor as anyone else is. Fighting and aggression should not be our main strategy. Proclamation of the truth and bearing witness to Christ is our main strategy. The sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God, is our main weapon, because our main fight is not against flesh and blood. And a literal sword is only a last resort. That means we should beware of allowing the battle against injustice to become a means for unjust oppression. History clearly shows that the new boss is the same as the old boss. The new ruler who came to power by promising the end of oppression and corruption often becomes just as oppressive and corrupt. Social justice warriors take note. It is not surprising how quickly the fight against bigotry, violence, and oppression can turn bigoted, violent, and oppressive. And therefore, we should closely examine the character and actual track record of the people making those promises, and not just naively believe the rhetoric. Next, I think as Christians, we should support a strong defense, even by the sword. Evil is real and needs to be resisted. And sometimes violence is the only tool that will stop violence. That does not mean it's our only tool. We should pray and attempt to reason and convince and resist in other ways. But the sword is also available to us when necessary. Again, Christians can be soldiers and cops with a good conscience, as long as they do their job well and justly. However, violence is only a defensive weapon. Christians should never use the sword, or even the threat of the sword, as an offensive weapon. Christians go on the offense by preaching the gospel, and secondarily by building hospitals and schools and rescue missions and staffing them. People's lives are changed by the truth of Christ and not by threat of punishment from us. Christians, in contrast with Muslims, should never try to convert anyone with threats or coercion. Rather, we try to teach and peacefully convince people, and we pray and rely on the Holy Spirit to actually change people's hearts. And we should guard so that we do all these things for the right motives. We should do them because they're the right things to do, and because they please and honor God. We should never do things with the attitude that they somehow contribute to our salvation. We do good works as a faithful response to our salvation, never as the reason for our salvation. If someone tells you that you can earn or contribute to your forgiveness by doing some good deed, don't believe them. In fact, don't listen to a person who would say such a thing. We are saved by grace through faith, not by works. We do good works because we are saved and forgiven, not in order to be saved and forgiven. And the final principle is that we should not give in to ideological shaming that is historically ignorant or deceptive. If someone ever brings up the Crusades to try to shame Christians or to argue against Christianity, hopefully now you know enough not to take them seriously. I suggest for the most part that you ignore them, unless other people are being deceived and hurt by their arguments. In that case, you probably should speak up with the truth. All right, that's all for our examination of the Crusades. This can be an emotional and/or controversial topic, but we need to address it honestly and accurately in order that we will be more intelligent and wise whenever we have to deal with analogous situations. Now, there's much more to explore if you wish to go beyond what we've covered, but I hope you've gained a survey understanding of the Crusades, the reasons for them, and the results that came after. And I pray that God will give you insight into what pleased and honored Him in this historical period, and what displeased and dishonored Him in this historical period, so that we all can grow in wisdom, so that we can better please and honor Him in whatever situations that we live through. In the next section, we'll look at some responses to what we saw in the medieval church, and I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for watching.